So this lecture is going to focus on the nitrogen cycle and farming practices, and we're going to first outline the steps of the nitrogen cycle, and then we'll talk about how that actually relates to farming practices. Okay, so we know that nitrogen is about 78% of the world's atmosphere. That consists in the form of nitrogen gas, N2, and the bond between these two atoms is very strong. So nitrogen is incredibly important for all life. But before life can use it, it has to be changed from atmospheric nitrogen into something that's a usable form. And in this case, plants need it to grow, so the bond must be broken of this nitrogen gas. And this is done through a process called fixation. So fixation can happen through a natural process of lightning passing through the atmosphere, but for the most part, fixation happens in the soil. And this happens through a process of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So certain soil bacteria can break that nitrogen bond and convert the atmospheric nitrogen N2 into ammonia. And this is the thing that we're going to focus all of our efforts on for this lecture. So there's my little guys. Nitrifying bacteria can transform this ammonia into a nitrate, which can now be used by plants. There's also certain kinds of plants that have the ability to fix nitrogen, and we'll talk about those in a little bit. But for the most part, plants are now using this nitrogen from the soil in the form of nitrates to form essential proteins to build their bodies. So let's take a look at this simplified nitrogen cycle. We're going to start with a couple of things here. So let's start by looking down here at the soil. Nitrogen can be fixed from the atmosphere by nitrogen-fixing bacteria, converted into nitrates, and that's taken up into the bodies of plants. Nitrates can get into the soil in other ways. Fertilizer is an example. Clovers or legumes, soybeans, the kinds of plants that have the ability to fix nitrogen. Here we go there. And then these things are actually consumed by an animal. So plant-eating animals consume and absorb these proteins, and afterwards they excrete the proteins that are not being used in the form of dung and urine. Dung can then be decomposed by bacteria and fungi, and the nitrogen, generally in the form of ammonia, is returned to the soil. And that's what we're looking at here. So you can also, as part of this cycle, have other outputs, and one of them is the fact that nitrogen can leach from the soil and end up in a water table or some body of water. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Alright, so here are the basic steps of the nitrogen cycle that I just want you to outline in your notes very briefly and quickly. The first step is bacteria have to fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere. The second is that now we have nitrates and nitrates, and those are produced by these bacteria and then are used by the plants to make proteins. Plants are then consumed by an animal, and the byproducts or the waste is then decomposed, converted into nitrogen, and returned to the soil. So this is a very simple step of the nitrogen cycle. So let's take a look at a farm. So what does this actually have to do with farming as a cycle? And if we know that plants need nitrogen, it's essential to their growth, it should be pretty clear that it actually has everything to do with farming. Let's take a look at another way to outline this cycle. I've got a crop. I know that this crop cannot take nitrogen from the atmosphere and use it in its body, though it needs nitrogen. So it must get it from the soil. And in this case, corn has to get it from nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So here's my corn. And here's my organism that can eat the corn and can excrete some waste. Okay, so the cycle begins with the atmospheric nitrogen entering the soil through the process of these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Okay, that's built then into the bodies of the corn and consumed by the plant-eating organism, returned in the form of waste to the soil. So this is the most basic, simple version of this nitrogen cycle that's essential for all life. So how does this actually play out in a farm? Let's take a look. Nitrogen that the cattle eat is excreted, and often for farms they store it and later apply it to a field before the corn is planted. These fields are being used over and over and over again for the same crop, and so the soil quality is quite degraded, and the nitrogen balance is off. And so reapplying this manure directly to the field before the corn is planted is really important for the farmer. Nitrogen can leave the farm also through leaching and runoff. That it looks sort of like leading, but it's leaching and runoff. And then the other piece is that nitrogen has to be brought into the farmland from other sources, and that's primarily done in the form of chemical fertilizers or nitrates. Okay, so this takes us to the idea of monoculture farming versus polyculture farming. And these are two modes of farming. They're two different ways of thinking about farming. One of them is much more prevalent in our culture, and the other is something that is much more traditional. But certainly monoculture is the thing that is used in the industrial farming agriculture business. So let's start with monoculture. Monoculture is the agricultural practice of producing or growing a single crop or plant species in a field at a time. Okay. The flip side of this is polyculture. Monoculture or monocropping, you sometimes hear it as, the same species is grown year after year in the same plot. And this can lead to all kinds of problems with the soil, including diseases and pests and the leaching of nitrates. But this is the practice that's widely used in agriculture, industrial agriculture currently, because it is relatively efficient for farmers to grow massive amounts of the same kinds of crops. And we know that that is driven largely by farm subsidies and America's need for these processed foods. Okay, so it is efficient for the farmer to use this practice. Polyculture, on the other side, is using multiple crops in a single space. It's an imitation of diversity in a natural ecosystem, and it avoids large stands of single crops, and year after year things are rotated and changed even within a field. Polyculture seeks to redefine the ag practices that are currently in place and move to this very diverse cropping system. Polyculture has a lot of advantages, and it does have the disadvantage of requiring much more labor, having more farm equipment, because you're going to need a variety of different equipment kinds to harvest your crops. But polyculture reduces susceptibility to disease, it increases crop yields, it increases local biodiversity, and of course it keeps the nitrogen balance in sync. Monoculture, on the flip side of that, promotes the use of excess fertilizer because the crops completely destroy the soil. It is very important to return nitrogen to the soil, and farmers need to do that through the use of widespread fertilizer use. Whereas in polyculture, this really allows for the nitrogen cycle to be very balanced. All right, so here's a look at a polyculture farm image. This is a very typical scene that you would see, where you have a lot of variety of plants and crops, and probably embedded within those plants are also clover or some kind of legume or soybean plant that's rotated out, because those are plants that actually have the capacity to take up nitrogen and return it to the soil. You also have an active livestock population, probably where the farmer is amassing their manure so that they can store it and then apply it to their fields directly. That decreases the use of fertilizer for them. All right, and here is the typical picture when we think of monoculture. Its fields look fertile, but the soil is actually destroyed by farmers who are trying to grow as much as possible. The soil stays richer when the crops are changed very often. This monoculture also means that big machines can't be used because big machines must be used because you have to grow in these straight lines for these machines. So you can't actually grow to the contours of the earth. You can't add trees or add in clover or other things because you're using these practices that can only support the singular crop that you're growing. So essentially, nutrient cycling in this agroecosystem is stunted by the practice of monoculture. It's something that's also having major environmental implications. So let's take a look at what that is. Nitrogen is negatively charged, and so is soil, and that means that nitrogen very readily and freely flows away from the soil whenever there's any kind of runoff or excess water. And so excess nitrogen very readily flows away from the farms and can build up in water tables very quickly, can build up in rivers and oceans and lakes. If there's too much in the soil, too much nitrate in the soil, it will very readily leach into these bodies of water. Leaching is the pathway of nitrogen loss, and it's a huge concern for water quality. So let's take a look at what has happened here. All right, so this is the dead zone. It's an area of hypoxia, which is low oxygen, little to no oxygen, and this is in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a huge area. This is about the size of Connecticut, which is, when you really think about in terms of an entire space of water no longer holding any kind of life, that's actually a very large area. This is the largest recurring hypoxic zone in the United States, and the reason for this is the drainage area for 41% of the United States, and primarily the Corn Belt or the Midwest. This dumps high nutrient nitrogen runoff and phosphorus directly into the Gulf of Mexico. So this vast drainage basin typically is a place of it's a lucrative commercial area for fisheries, and it completely shuts down for part of the year when there is this massive influx of nitrogen, or really nitrates, coming from these farms that are dumping fertilizer because of monoculture, because the plants need nitrogen and they're not getting it through the soil. And then the nitrogen actually runs off into this dead zone. So there's my dead zone. Oh. So if you look at this picture here of the United States, I have too many skulls. It's actually, well, you can see there on the left-hand corner there that it's the drainage basin for a huge percent of the United States, and it dumps off directly into the Mississippi River. So this has major economic and environmental implications.